smoothed her only good dress, a faded blue calico her mother had sewn before the fever took her 3 summers past. "Father, please, there must be another way." "Another way?" Samuel's laugh held no humor. "I owe Josiah Turner $800, and he's given me until sundown to pay or forfeit everything. This cabin, our land, even the clothes on our backs. That mountain man's willing to pay my debt for a wife. You should be grateful." Grateful? The word tasted like bile. To be sold like livestock? Her father's fist slammed the table. "You're not being sold, you're being married. It's different." But Margaret knew better. She'd heard her father negotiating with Josiah Turner 2 nights ago. Heard him describe her like a mare at auction. Young, healthy, knows how to cook and keep house. The memory made her stomach turn. The door opened without a knock, bringing a gust of frozen air and the scent of pine, leather, and something wild. Elijah Stone had to duck to enter, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the frame. Snow clung to his dark beard and the fur hood that shadowed his face. He stood there, silent, water pooling at his feet from the melting ice on his boots. "Mr. Stone!" Samuel rose, extending his hand with the false charm he reserved for business dealings. "Welcome. This is my daughter, Margaret Rose." The mountain man's gaze found her, and Margaret felt her breath catch. His eyes were gray as winter storm clouds, holding neither cruelty nor kindness, just a profound weariness that seemed older than his years. He nodded once, but didn't speak. "She's everything I promised," Samuel continued, filling the silence with his salesman's patter. "Knows her letters, can cipher some. Her mother trained her well in all the womanly arts before she passed. She'll make a fine wife." Elijah Stone pulled a leather pouch from inside his coat and set it on the table with a heavy thud. "800, as agreed." His voice surprised Margaret. Deep but soft, like distant thunder. She'd expected growls or grunts from the story she'd heard. Samuel's eyes glittered as he opened the pouch, counting the gold coins with greedy fingers. Yes, all here." He grabbed a pen and shoved the marriage contract forward. "Just need your mark here, and she's yours." "No," Margaret stepped forward, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't sign. You can't force me." Her father's face darkened. "You'll do as you're told, or I'll have Sheriff Watson drag you to the altar in chains. The law's on my side, girl. Until you're wed, you're my property to dispose of, as I see fit." She looked to Elijah Stone, searching for any sign of compassion in those storm-gray eyes. "Please, you don't want an unwilling wife. Surely you can see that." The mountain man studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name in surprisingly neat script. "The debt is paid. She comes with me." "No," Margaret backed toward her small room. "I need time. My things." "You've got 5 minutes," her father said. "Take only what you can carry, mister. Stone's got a long ride ahead." In her room, Margaret's hands shook as she gathered her few possessions, her mother's Bible, a silver brush, 2 spare dresses, undergarments, her sewing kit. Everything fit into a small canvas sack. She considered the window, but it was too small and the drop too far. Besides, where would she run in this blizzard? When she emerged, her father was already pouring himself a celebratory drink. He didn't look at her. "The preacher's waiting at Turner's trading post. He'll make it legal." Elijah Stone took her sack without a word and headed for the door. Margaret followed on numb legs, pausing at the threshold. "Goodbye, Father." Samuel Sullivan didn't turn around. "Don't make trouble for Mr. Stone, girl. You've shamed this family enough." The cold hit her like a physical blow. Elijah Stone was already loading her sack onto the mule, his movements efficient and practiced. He unhitched a second horse from the post, a gentle-looking mare with a thick winter coat. "Can you ride?" His question was practical, nothing more. "Yes," quote. He helped her mount, his hands careful to touch only her elbow and boot. Despite his size, his grip was surprisingly gentle. They rode in silence through the swirling snow. The town's scattered buildings were ghostly shapes in the white. Turner's trading post squatted like a toad beside the frozen creek. Inside, the air reeked of tobacco, wet wool, and unwashed men. Josiah Turner stood behind his counter, gold teeth gleaming in his merchant smile. Beside him, Reverend Dawson waited with his prayer book, looking uncomfortable. "Ah, the happy couple." Turner's voice oozed false warmth. "Samuel said you'd be along. Shall we proceed with the ceremony?" Margaret felt trapped in a nightmare. Around them, rough men paused their drinking and card games to watch. She recognized some faces. Men who'd tipped their hats to her on the street, who'd bought bread from her at church socials. Now they stared at her with curiosity and something darker. "Well, girlie," Turner prompted, "the Reverend's waiting." Quote. Elijah Stone moved closer, not touching, but creating a barrier between her and the leering crowd. "Outside," he said quietly. "We'll do this outside." Reverend Dawson shifted nervously. "Mr. Stone, it's freezing." Outside. There was iron in that soft voice now. They gathered on the trading post's porch, snow whipping around them. The Reverend rushed through the ceremony, stumbling over familiar words in his haste. Margaret stared at the wooden boards beneath her feet, unable to look at the man who was buying her like a sack of flour. "Do you, Elijah Stone, take this woman?" "I do." "Do you, Margaret Rose Sullivan, take this man?" The silence stretched. She felt Elijah shift beside her, felt the Reverend's nervous energy, felt the weight of her father's debt crushing her chest. "She does." Josiah Turner's voice boomed from the doorway. "Say it, girl, or I'll have the sheriff arrest your father for debt. He'll hang. You know they don't take kindly to welchers here." Margaret raised her head, meeting Elijah Stone's gray eyes. In them, she saw no triumph, no lust, no cruel satisfaction. Just that bone-deep weariness and something else, understanding. "I do." "Then, by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." Turner clapped slowly, mockingly. "Congratulations, Mrs. Stone. Your father's debt is cleared." They rode out of town as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks blood red. Margaret had never been this far from home, never seen the wilderness that swallowed the horizon. The cold numbed her face, her fingers, her heart. Elijah Stone rode ahead, leading the pack mule, his broad back a dark shape against the white. He hadn't spoken since the ceremony, hadn't looked back to see if she followed. What choice did she have but to follow? As darkness gathered and the temperature plummeted, Margaret began to understand the true price of her father's debt. She wasn't just leaving her home, she was leaving civilization itself, riding into a wilderness with a stranger who'd bought her like property. The wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, wolves answered. She was no longer Margaret Rose Sullivan. She was the mountain man's wife, heading into a life she couldn't imagine, with a man who might be gentle or cruel, generous or miserly. The unknown stretched before her as vast and cold as the Montana wilderness, and she had no choice but to meet it. Behind them, the lights of town disappeared into the storm, and Margaret didn't look back. The journey ended when Margaret could no longer feel her fingers. Through the swirling darkness, a shape emerged from the mountainside. Not the crude shack she'd imagined, but a solid log cabin with a stone chimney sending smoke into the night sky. Elijah Stone dismounted and began unloading the mule with practiced efficiency. Margaret sat frozen in her saddle, unsure if she should help or wait for instruction. Her husband, the word felt strange, hadn't spoken in hours. Finally, he appeared at her horse's side, arms raised to help her down. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs buckled when they touched ground. His hands steadied her, then withdrew immediately. He led the horses to a small stable attached to the cabin while Margaret stood in the snow, shivering and lost. The cabin door wasn't locked. Inside, warmth hit her like a blessing. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with neat shelves. Everything had its place: tools on pegs, dishes stacked precisely, books arranged by size. This wasn't the den of a wild man. It was the home of someone who valued order in a chaotic world. Elijah entered carrying her small sack, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. He set it near a narrow bed in the corner, little more than a cot with a thin mattress and a single wool blanket. "You'll sleep there." His voice was matter-of-fact. "Privy's out back, water barrels by the stove. Don't go outside alone after dark." Margaret looked from the cot to the larger bed across the room, understanding flooding through her, relief and confusion warring in her chest. He didn't expect. "Thank you," she whispered. He paused while hanging his coat on a peg. "For what?" "The bed. I thought." She stopped, heat rising in her cheeks. "You're here to cook and keep house. Nothing more." He moved to the stove, ladling something from a pot into 2 bowls. "Eat, then sleep. Work starts at dawn." The stew was simple but good. Venison, wild onions, and herbs she couldn't identify. They ate in silence at a rough table worn smooth by use. Margaret stole glances at her husband, trying to reconcile the fearsome mountain man of legend with this quiet person who kept his home neater than most women. His face, now visible without the fur hood, was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 winters. Scars marked his jaw and left eyebrow, but his features were strong rather than brutal. His hands, she noticed, were gentle with everything they touched, from the spoon to the bowl to the cloth he used to wipe the table clean. After supper, he showed her around with brief, practical statements. "Flour's in that barrel. Salt pork's in the cellar. Don't touch the rifles unless there's trouble. The big pot's for laundry. Monday's washing day." Quote. Margaret nodded at each instruction, overwhelmed by the strange domesticity of it all. When he finished, she stood awkwardly by her cot. "May I ask a question?" He was banking the fire for the night, movements precise and economical. "Ask. Why did you pay my father's debt? Why did you want a wife?" His hand stilled on the poker for a long moment. Only the fire's whisper filled the cabin. "Didn't want a wife." His voice was quiet. "Turner came to me. Said a man owed him money, had a daughter. Said if I didn't take the deal, he'd sell the information to the mining camps." He looked up. What happens to young women in mining camps isn't fit for speaking. Margaret's throat constricted. She'd heard whispers about the mining camps, about what desperate men did to women with no protection. "So you saved me." He shrugged. "Made a business arrangement." He set the poker aside and moved to his own bed. "Sleep now. Dawn comes early." Margaret lay on her narrow cot, pulling the thin blanket to her chin. The cabin grew quiet, except for the fire's dying crackles and the wind howling outside. She should have been terrified, alone with a stranger in the wilderness. Instead, she felt oddly safe. This man who'd bought her like property had also saved her from a worse fate. The contradiction made her head spin. Sometime in the deep of night, she woke to darkness and cold. The fire had died, and her thin blanket offered little protection against the mountain chill. She curled into a ball, teeth chattering, too proud to complain. A movement in the darkness made her freeze. Footsteps crossed the floor, not toward her, but to a chest near the wall. She heard rustling, then those same careful footsteps approached her cot. She squeezed her eyes shut, feigning sleep. Weight settled over her, soft, warm, heavy. A wolf pelt. It still carried the heat from where it had lain near the fire. The footsteps retreated, and she heard Elijah settle back into his bed. Margaret pulled the pelt closer, breathing in its wild scent. This small kindness given in darkness when he thought she slept said more than any words. She lay awake long after, trying to understand the man who'd married her. Dawn came like Elijah had promised, early and demanding. Margaret woke to find him already up, stoking the fire and heating water. He glanced at her once, noting the wolf pelt, but said nothing. "Coffee's ready," was all he offered. She dressed quickly behind a blanket hung for privacy, then set about making breakfast with the supplies he'd shown her: flapjacks, bacon, and coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe. He ate without comment but cleaned his plate, which she took as approval. The days fell into a rhythm. Elijah left after breakfast to check trap lines, returning at dusk with pelts or game. Margaret kept the cabin, learning its particular needs. The stove needed feeding just so. The water barrel required breaking ice on cold mornings. The floors, she discovered, were worn smooth by years of one man's footsteps following the same paths. They spoke little. He instructed. She acknowledged. He provided. She prepared. Yet in the silence, she began to read him. The way he always knocked snow from his boots before entering, how he never reached across her at table, always asked her to pass things, the careful distance he maintained, never crowding her in the small space. A week passed before she found the books. She had been cleaning, moving a chair, when she discovered a trunk tucked beneath his bed. Inside lay treasures, volumes of Shakespeare, poetry by Wordsworth, even a few novels. The books were well read, margins noted in that same neat script she'd seen on their marriage certificate. "You can read them if you like." She jumped, not hearing him return. He stood in the doorway, afternoon light haloing his snow-dusted form. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's not prying, you live here now." He moved to hang up his coat, bringing in the sharp scent of winter pine. "Can you read?" "Yes. My mother taught me." She touched one volume reverently. "I didn't expect what books, poetry here." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. Winter nights are long. A man needs something besides his own thoughts for company. That evening, after supper was cleared, he pulled out a worn volume and began reading aloud. His voice transformed the simple cabin, filling it with Hamlet's anguish and Lear's madness. Margaret sat transfixed, her mending forgotten, watching firelight play across his face as he brought Shakespeare to life in the wilderness. When he finished, silence stretched between them, but it was different now, companionable rather than strained. "My turn tomorrow," she ventured. He nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "If you like." This became their evening ritual. After the day's work, they'd share stories by firelight. Margaret discovered he favored the romantics, while she preferred adventure tales. He listened to her read with the same focused attention he gave everything, and she found herself choosing passages she thought might please him. The second week brought a blizzard that trapped them inside for 3 days. The forced closeness should have been unbearable. Instead, Margaret found herself relaxing into their quiet coexistence. She learned he carved as a pastime, producing intricate figures from pine and cedar, birds mostly, captured mid-flight with such detail she could count individual feathers. "They're beautiful," she said, examining a tiny wren. He shrugged. "Helps keep the hands busy." On the blizzard's second night, she woke to find him sitting by the fire, a half-carved owl in his hands. Something in his posture spoke of old pain. "Couldn't sleep?" He glanced at her. "Storm's loud," but she sensed it wasn't the wind keeping him awake. She rose, wrapping the wolf pelt around her shoulders, and sat across from him. They watched the fire together, not speaking, but the silence felt like sharing. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world clean and new. And for the first time, Margaret realized she was no longer counting the days since she'd left town. She was living them. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far?" The language of their life together wasn't built on words. It grew from small gestures, repeated actions, and quiet understanding that bloomed between two people learning to share space. By the 4th week, Margaret could predict Elijah's movements as surely as sunrise. The way he checked the door latch twice before bed, how he always left the last piece of cornbread for her, the particular rhythm of his whittling when something troubled him. She'd taken to mending by the fire while he carved, their silence comfortable as old friends. This evening, she noticed him working on something different, smaller, more delicate than his usual birds. His knife moved with unusual care, brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you making?" He glanced up briefly, just passing time. But she saw how he shielded the piece with his body, how his thumb swept over it repeatedly, testing the smoothness. When he finally retired earlier than usual, the small carving went with him, tucked into his shirt pocket. The next morning brought fresh snow and a change in routine. Instead of heading to his trap lines after breakfast, Elijah lingered, standing awkwardly by the table. "Something wrong?" Margaret asked, concern threading her voice. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the carving, a tiny wooden sparrow, so detailed she could see individual tail feathers. He set it on the table between them, not quite meeting her eyes. "For you." Margaret lifted the delicate bird, marveling at the craftsmanship. Unlike his other carvings, this one had been polished until it gleamed, smooth as riverstone. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But why?" "Thought you might like it." He shifted, uncomfortable with the conversation. "For yourself. the one by your bed." She had arranged a small collection there, her mother's Bible, the silver brush, a few pressed flowers she'd found in the pages of one of his books. He'd noticed. This man who spoke perhaps 20 words a day had noticed her small attempt to make the corner her own. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. "I'll treasure it." Quote. He nodded once and escaped to his traps, but she caught the faint, pleased look that flickered across his face. Days passed and their communication deepened. A bowl of soup placed just so on the table meant you looked tired. Rest while you eat. The fire built before dawn meant I heard you shivering last night. A new cake of soap appearing by the wash basin meant I noticed you were running low. Margaret responded in kind. His favorite shirt mended with tiny, careful stitches, extra coffee strong and black on mornings after restless nights, pine boughs arranged on the mantel because she'd seen him smile at their scent. The first time he truly spoke beyond instructions came on a night when wind rattled the cabin walls. Margaret had been reading aloud from Ivanhoe when a fierce gust made the whole structure groan. She paused, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "Built to last," Elijah said quietly, "stood through worse than this." "How long have you lived here?" she asked. He was silent for a long while. "7 winters alone," he said finally. "Mostly." "Mostly?" "Had a partner once. Fellow trapper. Good man." He stared into the fire. "Avalanche took him 5 winters back. Been just me since." "I'm sorry. Mountains take what they want," he said softly, "but they give too. Peace, purpose. A place where a man can think." "What do you think about?" He looked at her then, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Used to think about the past," he said. "Now, different things." The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. A door long closed had cracked open. Their quiet bond was tested soon after. Margaret was gathering kindling when she slipped on ice, twisting her ankle. She limped inside, trying to hide the pain, but Elijah noticed immediately. "Sit," he ordered gently, kneeling before her. His hands were impossibly careful as he examined the swelling. "Not broken," he said. "Needs wrapping." He fetched cloth and bound her ankle with the same precision he gave everything. "You should have called out," he said. "I didn't want to bother you." He looked up then, gray eyes serious. "You're not a bother. You're my wife." Quote. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. He finished wrapping her ankle and stood, already moving to take over her chores. "I can still work," she protested. "Rest, heal." He paused at the door. "That's not a request." It was the first time he'd used her name without formality. "Rest, Margaret." The sound of it in his quiet voice did something strange to her heart. That night, she watched him prepare supper. This man who'd bought her to save her, who gave her warmth in the night and space to breathe, who touched her only with gentleness. "Elijah," she said softly. He turned. "Thank you for everything." He shrugged. "You were cold." 3 words, simple as ever, but Margaret understood what lay beneath them. Concern, protection, maybe even the beginnings of care. As winter deepened, so did their connection. She caught him watching her sometimes, not possessively, but as if studying a sunrise he hadn't expected to see again. One night she laughed at a story he told about a raccoon stealing his jerky, and the sound made him freeze mid-sentence. "Like that sound," he murmured. "Then maybe you should make me laugh more," she teased gently. By spring's first thaw, the walls between them had melted as surely as the snow outside. Margaret found herself humming while she worked, and Elijah, once a man of silence, began to talk, little by little. He taught her to track game, to read the sky, to recognize which herbs soothed burns or fevers. One morning, while they walked near a thawing creek, he stopped suddenly. "You belong," he said quietly. "What?" "Here, with the mountains. You don't fight it anymore." "I had a good teacher," she replied. That earned her a small smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Weeks later, the world turned green again. Margaret found peace in their routines, in the soft rhythm of life they had built together. But the past has long memories, and peace in the wilderness never lasted forever. It began with a sound: horses on the trail. Margaret was tending the garden Elijah had built for her when 3 riders appeared, rough men with familiar sneers, her father's kind of men. One called out, "Elijah's stone!" She froze, hands trembling around the hoe. Elijah stepped from the cabin, rifle in hand, but relaxed. "What's your business?" "Got a letter for you, from Josiah Turner. Says the girl you bought weren't yours to keep." The man spat in the snow. "Says her pa wants her back, or paid for again." Elijah's eyes darkened. "Tell Turner he's already been paid once. He won't see another coin." "That ain't how he tells it." The man reached for his gun. In one smooth motion, Elijah raised his rifle. "I don't miss," he said simply. The men hesitated, glancing between the silent forest and the gray eyes that promised no mercy. Finally, the lead rider swore and wheeled his horse. "Fine, mountain man. But Turner don't forgive insults easy." They galloped off, swallowed by the trees. Margaret ran to Elijah. "What does he mean?" "Means Turner's still greedy," Elijah said grimly, "and your father's still drunk." Quote, That night, neither of them slept much. The wolves howled closer than usual, restless. Margaret sat by the fire, watching the flames dance shadows on the walls. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked. "Maybe," Elijah admitted, "but they'll find we're not alone." He nodded toward the window, where yellow eyes gleamed faintly through the dark. The wolves had gathered again, their silent watch unbroken. The days that followed were filled with unease, but also a strange strength. Margaret no longer feared the wilderness. It had become her protector, her home, and Elijah, once a stranger bound to her by contract, had become her safe place within it. When trouble came again, they faced it together. Turner's bounty hunters, her father's lies, even death's shadow, could not undo what they'd built. Through it all, their bond only deepened, forged by fire, tested by storm, made strong as mountain stone. And one quiet morning years later, when Margaret stood at their garden fence with a baby in her arms, Elijah wrapped his arms around her waist and whispered, "You remember when you said you didn't want to be the mountain man's wife?" She smiled through tears. "I was wrong." He kissed her forehead. "You were cold, but now I'm home," she finished softly. The wolves howled on the ridgeline, not with warning but with joy. A wild song for a love that had survived winter and found spring. The girl no one wanted,